Kandinsky here. I've just been publishing on the section, The Language of Form and Color, in his book concerning the spiritual in art. And the invitation is to go back a couple of videos to the discussion of the spiritual qualities of like yellow and blue, black and white, red and green, and orange and violet. And I talked about how this was sort of relevant to the self-referential quality of the book itself, and the connections to human personality and to music that have been running throughout this. So it's a fascinating discussion of color, as well as form earlier. And now he wants to sort of move into sort of more general comments about color. And I need to, yeah, again, the invitation is for the description of the playlists, which is also helpful to get sort of my context for this. And what I need is this. Again, I'll show all of these just in case it will entice anyone to check out the discussion of all this. It's obviously we'll like pause and have a look at what this is because this is crazy. And there's more like so, and even more, which we're going to talk about now, which is this one. And so he says, quote, this is from 41. It's clear that all I've said of these simple colors is very provisional and general, and so also are those feelings like joy and grief, which have been quoted as parallels of the colors. For these feelings are only the material expressions of the soul. Shades of color, like those of sound, are of a much finer texture and awake in the soul emotions too fine to be expressed in words. Certainly, each tone will find some probable expression in words, but it will always be incomplete, and that part which the word fails to express will not be unimportant, but rather the very kernel of its existence. For this reason, words are and will always remain only hints, mere suggestions of colors. In this impossibility of expressing color in words, with a consequent need for some other mode of expression, lies the opportunity of the art of the future. In this art, among innumerable rich and varied combinations, there is one which is founded on firm fact, and that is as follows, quote, the actual expression of color can be achieved simultaneously by several forms of art, each art playing its separate part, and producing a whole which exceeds in richness and force any expression attainable by one art alone. The immense possibilities of depth and strength to be gained by combination or by discord between the various arts can be easily realized. So again, what he's been talking about here is the sort of the way that you can sort of use color as you could say metaphor or analogy in a way between different kinds of art, such as the different not only in painting, right, but also in music, as two examples. And he's talking about how these different kinds of art can sort of converge in the way, not exactly in this way, but we see here how there's an orientation toward different kinds of art, each converging upon uh, a sort of a more whole expression of what we mean by the colors, and quote unquote their spiritual qualities. So I would talk about this particularly in the context of group practice, right? And this, whether we call them hyper objects or whatever you like, it's sort of these uh, artistic, you could say facts or realities that are difficult to express with through only one individual and in only one form of art. The idea is that the art of the future is based upon this kind of convergence, this kind of production of wholes involving several different forms of art. And so I've talked about this in the context of creative intelligence and group flow. So I'll just keep quoting him at the moment. He says, It's often said that admission of the possibility of one art helping another amounts to a denial of the necessary differences between the arts. This is not, however, the case. As has been said, an absolutely similar inner appeal cannot be achieved by two different arts. Even if it were possible, the second version would differ at least outwardly. Quote, but suppose this were not the case. That is to say, suppose a repetition of the same appeal exactly alike, both outwardly and inwardly, could be achieved by different arts. Such repetition would not be merely superfluous. This gets easier in a second. He goes on, to begin with, different people find sympathy in different forms of art. Different people find sympathy with different forms of art. So to me, this is really resonating with the Neoplatonism of Proclus and the sympathy with nature that we see in Henry Corbin. So we're talking about here about deep connection with nature and with, in a way, that which art points to as the natural, and how different kinds of personality, different kinds of people can connect, let's say sympathetically, in different ways. For example, through different forms of art. The harmony being, again, in their convergence. Again, quote, to begin with, different people find sympathy in different forms of art, alike on the active and passive side among the creators or the receivers of the appeal. Quote, but further and more important, repetition of the same appeal, artistic appeal, thickens the spiritual atmosphere, which is necessary for the maturing of the finest feelings, in the same way as the hot air of a greenhouse is necessary for the ripening of certain fruit. Quote, an example of this is in the case of the individual who receives a powerful impression from constantly repeated actions, thoughts, or feelings. Although if they came singly, they might have passed by unnoticed. This idea, of course, forms the fundamental reason for advertisement. So he's talking about repetition and indeed the discipline of repetition, habit. And that can have to do with not only artistic practice, but receiving different kinds of impressions. So again, clear links to intentional practice, group work involving repetition, habit, building rhythm, periodicity, seasonality, ritual. Anyway, then he says, we must not, however, apply this rule only to the simple examples of the spiritual atmosphere. Quote, for this atmosphere is like air, which can be either pure or filled with various alien elements. Not only visible actions, thoughts, or feelings with outward expression make up this atmosphere, but secret happenings of which no one knows, unspoken thoughts, hidden feelings are also elements in it. Quote, suicide, murder, violence, low and unworthy thoughts, hate, hostility, egotism, envy, narrow patriotism, partisanship are elements in the spiritual atmosphere. Quote, epidemics of suicide or of violent warlike feeling are products of this impure atmosphere. So he's talking about the way that sort of the reality of what we experience inside, it has an effect on the atmosphere, the way that things are, even if it doesn't seem that it does. It's like the whole tone of everything can be so influenced by what we feel, what we think, and so on. The idea being that it's not enough to sort of bottle that stuff up inside because it still has an effect on the atmosphere, right? We have to, in a way, go work out safe and healthy ways to express that stuff in the kinds of ritual contexts through catharsis and so on, emotional work that mean that we don't have to suffer from the presence of that stuff in the quote unquote spiritual atmosphere. He says, quote, and conversely, self-sacrifice, mutual help, lofty thoughts, love, unselfishness, joy in the success of others, which is called compersion. Humanity, justness are the elements which slay those already enumerated, as the sun slays the microbes, and restore the atmosphere to purity. These elements likewise have their historical periods. Okay, well, There's only two more pages in the section, so I'm going to keep going here. He says, the second and more complicated form of repetition, and again, this repetition, you see if I can get why he's sort of talking about repetition in the appeal of different forms of art. Why is he talking about that? And it's difficult to say. He wants to say that it's a way of, I would connect it with a way of practicing so as to receive art more deeply, and also practicing in such a way so as to create more, um, create with greater fidelity to the depths of who we are, something like that. Anyway, I'll keep going. He says, the second and more complicated form of repetition is that in which several different elements make mutual use of different forms. In our case, these elements are the different arts summed up in the art of the future. In our case, these elements are the different arts. Okay. Again, he was talking more about how the different arts can combine in the future, namely our time and even further. And this form of repetition is even more powerful, for the different natures of men respond to the different elements in the combination. Quote, for one, the musical form is the most moving and impressive. For another, the pictorial. For the third, the literary, and so on. There reside, therefore, in arts which are outwardly different, hidden forces, equally different, so that they may all work in one man towards a single result, even though each art may be working in isolation. So to me, this is about the ecology of practices. The idea that imagine that each of these was in kind of intentional practice. For Viveki, he's talked about dialogical, imaginal, mindful, and embodied practices. Well, they work in a kind of self-generating feedback loop. Quote, this sharply defined working of individual colors is the basis on which various values can be built up in harmony. Yeah, and so I would talk here about aspirational development and the development of wisdom in relationship to different virtues. So the harmonious relationship between different kinds of virtues in a wisdom school model. Anyway, he says, pictures will come to be painted, veritable artistic arrangements, planned in shades of one color, chosen according to artistic feeling. The carrying out of one color, the binding together and admixture of two related colors, are the foundations of most colored harmonies. From what has been said above about color working, from the fact that we live in a time of questioning, experiment, and contradiction, we can draw the easy conclusion that for a harmonization on the basis of individual colors, our age is especially unsuitable. Perhaps with envy and with a mournful sympathy, we listen to the music of Mozart. It acts as a welcome pause in the turmoil of our inner life, as a consolation and as a hope. But we hear it as the echo of something from another age, long past and fundamentally strange to us. The strife of colors, the sense of balance we have lost, tottering principles, unexpected assaults, great questions, apparently useless striving, storm and tempest, broken chains, antitheses and contradictions. These make up our harmony. The composition arising from this harmony is a mingling of color and form, each with its separate existence, but each blended into a common life, which is called a picture by the force of the inner need. Only these individual parts are vital. Everything else, such as surrounding conditions, is subsidiary. The combination of two colors is a logical outcome of modern conditions. The combination of colors hitherto considered discordant is merely a further development. For example, the use, side by side, of red and blue, colors in themselves of no physical relationship, but from their very spiritual contrast of the strongest effect, is one of the most frequent occurrences in modern choice of harmony. Harmony today rests chiefly on the principle of contrast, which has for all time been one of the most important principles of art. But our contrast is an inner contrast, which stands alone and rejects the help of any other principles of harmony. For help would mean destruction. It's interesting to note that this very placing together of red and blue was so beloved by the, quote, primitive, both in Germany and Italy, that it has till today survived, principally in folk pictures of religious subjects. One often sees it in pictures like the Virgin in a red gown and a blue cloak. One often sees in such pictures the Virgin in a red gown and a blue cloak. Okay, it seems that the artists wished to express the grace of heaven in terms of humanity, and humanity in terms of heaven. Legitimate and illegitimate combinations of colors, contrasts of various colors, the overpainting of one color with another, the definition of colored surfaces by boundaries of various forms, the overstepping of these boundaries, the mingling and the sharp separation of surfaces. All these open great vistas of artistic possibility. A little bit more, couple paragraphs. He says, one of the first steps in the turning away from material objects into the realm of the abstract was, to use the technical artistic term, the rejection of the third dimension. So it's the removal of self-reference, which is exactly what happened in the book, right? We moved away from the material toward the abstract, away from the self-reference, and into the interiority. That is to say, the attempt to keep the picture on a single plane. Modeling was abandoned. In this way, the material object was made more abstract, and an important step forward was achieved. This step forward has, however, had the effect of limiting the possibilities of painting to one definite piece of canvas. And this limitation has not only introduced a very material element into painting, but has seriously lessened its possibilities. So to me, this is that's the nature of limitation, and this sense of the material is quite contra his discussion of blue, which was associated with meaning, with depth, with introversion, and with heaven. He says, any attempt to free painting from this material limitation, together with the striving after a new form of composition, must concern itself first of all with the destruction of this theory of one single surface. Attempts must be made to bring the picture onto some ideal plane, which shall be expressed in terms of the material plane of the canvas. So this resonates so much with Corbin and the restoration of the third dimension. William Desmond being in the between, Corbin going back toward Persian Sufism. So this idea of the single dimension is stemming from the fact of the Greek alphabet, actually, and sort of modern materiality as a result of that profound change. Anyway, we'll continue. He says, there has arisen out of the composition in flat triangles a composition with plastic three-dimensional triangles. That is to say, with pyramids, and that is cubism. But there has arisen here also the tendency to inertia, to a concentration on this form for its own sake, and consequently, once more to an impoverishment of possibility. But that is the unavoidable result of the external application of an inner principle. So to me, what this is connected with is, so he's talking about, in a sense, limitation and sort of modern limitations in artistic forms. And there's a way that, again, that the blueness of interiority and inner depth and meaning and introversion and concentric movement I also connected it with ego strength and with shadow, because there was a connection between blue and blackness. And so those qualities are indeed bounded and that's or limited, and that is actually the source of their power. So it makes deep sense to me that it's kind of like individuality, quite individuality, right? To be an individual, you have to be limited and bounded as such. You can't avoid that. And it's actually by means of that limitation that one strives toward heaven, so to speak, which is the whole point of the spiritual quality of blue, I would say. The last paragraph reads, a further point of great importance must not be forgotten. There are other means of using the material plane as a space of 3 dimensions in order to create an ideal plane. The thinness or thickness of a line, the placing of the form on the surface, the overlaying of one form on another may be quoted as examples of artistic means that may be employed. Similar possibilities are offered by color, which, when rightly used, can advance or retreat, and can make of the picture a living thing, and so achieve an artistic expansion of space. The combination of both means of extension in harmony or concord, the combination of both means of extension in harmony or concord in both form and color is one of the richest and most powerful elements in purely artistic composition. So I'll leave that where it is because it's a bit difficult, right? But I would also see hexagram 60 in the I Ching. And that was difficult, wasn't it? All right, I'll leave that there.